Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Frank Schmigel. I'm the Associate Curator for Public Programs here at SFMOMA. And as my colleague Dominic Wilsden suggested, I am partially responsible for the backdrop that is framing our speakers this afternoon. It is the third piece, the third set of a rotating stage for Simon Fujiwara's performance piece, The Boy Who Cried Wolf. The performance runs again tonight, so if you're not watching us online and are in San Francisco, you can join us at 8 o'clock. But Simon is in the exhibition in the book, The Air We Breathe, and so on the occasion of this symposium and Absara's show, we wanted to bring this special piece that we co-commissioned with the Performa biennial in New York. And what the piece does is a fictional exploration of the artist's coming out in front of an abstract painting in St. Ives. The artist exploring the possibility of writing an erotic novel about his father, who ran a bar under Generalissimo Franco's regime in Spain. And then finally the proposal for a wedding where the artist imagines getting married to his best friend after he discovers a camera in a cab in New York that has other people's wedding photographs on them. And so he meditates on the kind of banality of marriage. But just listening to Jenny Pizer in the previous conversation, I realized, the backdrop is less silly than I worried. When she talked about the real importance of the ceremonial and how important that is for our community. And also, I think it's just a great segue to our two speakers right now. I love Jenny's comment that legal principle must be paired to a communication of why it matters. And I think that's something that artists do, that's something that The Air We Breathe does, and it's something that our two speakers in this middle section have spent their lives doing, is creating powerful communication strategies for why our community matters and why certain things need to happen on its behalf. So seated at the right of the stage right of the table is Paul Boneberg. He's been a San Francisco-based community AIDS activist, and in 1979 he served on the board of directors for the Gay Rights March on Washington. He was the executive director of mobilization against AIDS in the late 80s and early 90s, and he's currently an active curator and the executive director of the Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgendered Historical Society and Museum, located in the Castro district here in San Francisco, which celebrates 100 years of the city's queer past. And we had a great conversation this week about just how much people wanted this center to not just be an archive, but to be an active programming and exhibition space, and he's been pulling that together so well. He's also recently appeared in the acclaimed documentary film We Were Here, which is an amazing film that I'm sure these folks will talk about, by David Wiseman and Bill Weber, which chronicles how the AIDS epidemic decimated gay men in San Francisco in the 80s and the early 90s. And seated next to Paul is Cleve Jones, who began his career in the 70s, worked as an intern for Harvey Milk while he was studying political science at the San Francisco State University. He was one of the first folks to recognize the threat of the AIDS epidemic. He's the co-founder of the San Francisco AIDS Foundation, and of course we probably all know him as the founder of the NAMES Project, the AIDS Memorial Quilt. He's also a member of the advisory board of the American Foundation for Equal Rights, a senior advisor to the Courage Campaign, which is an online network that empowers grassroots and netroots activists to push for progressive change and full equality in California and across the country. And I also know that he travels everywhere with his activist message. So we're incredibly pleased and honored that he could shake off the jet lag and join us today. So please welcome Paul and Cleve.
Well, I think Cleve and I are sort of doing a back and forth, and maybe I'll start with just sort of an observation on the general idea of the relationship of art, culture, and queer activism. And it's just wonderful and so appropriate that this extraordinary institution is hosted this symposium, the art show, the performance. It's just it's wonderful, and I'm honored to be here. And I think it speaks to the ongoing relationship. To me, queer activism has always been driven by culture and artists. In effect, we are a community created by queer artists of different types. I mean, my first recollection of realizing it was a queer community is, reading Whitman and James Baldwin, and a sense of it was the artists that actually connected. And San Francisco, if you go back even further, you find a whole series of artistic cultural activities that promote the queer community, the GLBT community as we know it today. So to me, it's the same thing and always been the same thing. If anything, the cultural activism is foundational, and the political activism is sort of layered on top of that. And I'll give you an example, just sort of one example from my own life, which is I was the executive director of a group called Mobilization Against AIDS, which unless you happen to be there, no one now would remember the organization or its battles. And if I said, you know, there were battles around appropriations and around drug access and Ronald Reagan, and basically, generally, people don't recall any of that at all. There was a quarantine initiative in California where they're actually going to quarantine people with AIDS. By and large, very little historical memory. But the other thing the organization did was it helped organize and expand the International AIDS Candlelight Memorials, which went out internationally throughout the whole world and for a period of time were a very important symbolic event. It was basically community art. It was performance art. And it allowed, in many very repressive countries, for people with AIDS to be visible. And often was the first, most visible activity that a group took. And it taught me that the art endures, that the culture endures, that was the foundation upon which many other activities began. And so I guess, Cleve, that's sort of how I look at it. I start with, well, the culture was first. The culture was fundamental, and the activism comes from that. And I guess if you would speak to, you know, as you, perhaps with AIDS, but perhaps even before AIDS with Harvey, if you want to talk a little about how you see art and culture connecting into your activism.
Thank you. I was actually thinking about it very late last night because I was down at the encampment at Justin Herman Plaza. I'm part of a group of people that we call ourselves the Gray Wall. And we're ready to put ourselves between the police and the protesters. And so there was a raid alert last night, and I got the text message and went down, and the police didn't show up. But I wandered around the encampment for several hours, and there was a lot of celebration, but it's also the rituals, the creation of these rituals. And I was just looking at these images and emerging rituals and vocabulary that they've created and the way they conduct their meetings. And I felt very old. But also it did, you know, it reminded me so much of when we were doing what we did. And, you know, one thing that is very different today is that those of us of a certain age who learned about the movement early enough. I discovered the movement in 1971 in the pages of Life magazine while I was in high school in Phoenix, and that, you know, gave me hope to survive. I was one of those kids who could very easily have committed suicide. And so the first inkling I got was in Life magazine, and it was the photographs of the Zaps and the very dramatic street actions that were being done by the Gay Liberation Front in New York and LA, and it was those images, I think, that moved me the most. Our community does this, and we do it very well, but one of the things that has changed is that back then, I think all of us we were very aware that what we were doing really was brand new. So there was an electricity to it all. There was an excitement about it. We were much nicer to each other back then, or at least I like to remember it that way. Maybe I'm mistaken. In my neighborhood, we have a new sort of ritual of images that has emerged on the corner there, just down from your place, what used to be the Hibernia Bank. And now when people pass away, people put up photographs and poetry or newspaper clippings. When Frank Kameny passed away, there were a lot of clippings up there and images. And sometimes it's spontaneous. In the case of the quilt, it was very calculated, though. I had the idea in sort of a flash at the annual tribute to Harvey and George, which is November 27th, and that was the year that was November of '85, which was the year that in November the death toll in our neighborhood hit 1,000. And I think it was also really clear to us by the fall of 1985 that it would continue as horrendously as it did. So our neighborhood, we were losing 1,500 to 2,000 a year in that immediately, sort of, 12 blocks. And so I had the idea, with the quilt, I got that. That was sort of a revelation maybe, but then I thought about it for a year, and it was very calculated. It was, a big part of it was that quilting was seen as a women's art form, as a feminine art form. And this disease was seen so much as a product of aggressive gay male sexuality. When I say the word quilt, I think most of us, when we say the word quilt, we think of our grandmothers. I certainly do. I think of my grandma. I think of my great-grandma, the quilt she made that I still have, made out of my great-grandfather's pajama remnants back in Bee Ridge, Indiana. I think of Conestoga wagons and pioneer women preparing the meal, and we've heard the stories of African Americans held in slavery in the South, taking the cast-off remnants of garments and sewing them. There was the symbolism of different colors and different textures of pieces that had no little value separately, but when joined together. It also, I thought, could work as therapy, as art therapy, if you will, for people who at that time had, were so cut off often from our families and the communities that we were born into. So many people went through such horrendous grief without any help. So all of these things were sort of playing out in my mind. And as the first group of volunteers came together, we were really, 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 really careful and conscious of all of this. So, it worked. And at that point, this was also, the time of the quilt was also the time that ACT UP was getting going, and some people tried to contrast the two, but honestly, it was very much the same people who were doing it. But ACT UP, I think, has been somewhat romanticized. I participated in a great many of the actions, but it was overwhelmingly white, college-educated men from middle-class backgrounds. There was basically a uniform and a vocabulary. And I kept thinking, the two people on this planet that are going to grieve the most when I die of this horrible disease are my grandmothers, who loved me so much. And, I just couldn't see them wearing Doc Martens and a black leather jacket storming the NIH. But I would wear Doc Martens and a black leather jacket and storm the NIH. But Nana, I just couldn't see it. But there had to be a place for her in the movement. And so I think that's part of the role of art in social movements, is to inspire people in a new way, to inform people in a new way, and to draw them in ways that encourage a response that perhaps a leaflet or a speech or a political party would not be able to do.
Yeah, a conscious effort towards inclusion, towards making it so that the quilt includes all, and you go there and you see the immense, extraordinary diversity of it. It welcomes all, it includes all, that it is that. Another symbol of queer liberation that we sometimes sort of take for granted because it's everywhere is, of course, the rainbow flag, which is another symbol of hope and inclusivity and welcoming. And now it's an appropriated symbol. I mean, there were rainbow flags before Gilbert recreated it, so it was our rainbow flag. But it's another image like the quilt, which is inclusive and it invites you in. And it's sometimes not even seen of as a political. You don't think necessarily that this is a political vehicle, but if you're putting rainbow flags in your bumper stickers in places where there could be a problem, or you're flying rainbow flags in neighborhoods because you live there and you want to say I'm queer, it is political, and it becomes a tool by which art is being used to advance the broader argument. To me, it's always been that way. I mean, does it, when you go back even before the AIDS stuff, Cleve, to me, when I look at, say, take someone like Jose Sarria. Now that I've become involved in history, I'm familiar. The first openly gay candidate in the world was a San Franciscan named Jose Sarria. He ran for office in 1961. He was a a performer, a drag queen. He was called the Nightingale of Montgomery Street. And Jose would perform, and every night he would turn up the lights and say to everyone, there's nothing wrong with being gay. You have to take care of yourselves. And then he would lead the crowd out of the Black Cat, which was the famous bar they were at, and they would serenade the jail with God Bless Us Nellie Queens. And it's street theater. I mean, it is political activism, not quite ACT UP. Of course, it was much more dangerous for them to be doing it. But to me, I look at that and I see art and culture in the beginning, and it's not a surprise that the first openly gay candidate is an artist, is, well, a performer who thought about it. There was also a situation where they were using to raid the bars. Jose was in the time when they were raiding the bars, and they would arrest them on the impersonating the opposite sex, because of course Jose was in gowns and many people were. So Jose just put a little note on his dress that said, "I am a boy," and had everyone do that. And that was so they couldn't arrest him because he had defeated them, in effect, with symbolic art. And, you know, it's, to me, that is the activism that often is our community. It's just, that's so typically us, and wonderfully also San Francisco. Jose, by the way, survives. Jose is 88 now, still alive, was up just last month celebrating his 50th run. So, did you see it earlier?
Is he living in Palm Springs?
No, he's moved to Albuquerque, actually. He's moved to
Albuquerque, a hot spot for aging drag queens. You know, I would like us to be able to take credit for it. And, you know, Larry Kramer says that gay people are special, and I used to believe that fervently, less so as I get older. There are many examples from many struggles how important art has been. And we were watching it unfold, the performance art of the encampments and the massive peace marches and rallies. But one thing that was very different back in the day that I sometimes find myself forgetting about was just how singularly focused we were just on proclaiming our existence. And this is one thing when I'm often talking to young people, it's the best part of my life, really, is I get to spend a lot of time with high school kids and college students. And you know, when I describe to them that period in history where we were completely invisible, and I mean, I believe I'm 57. I just turned 57, and I'm not on your list of birthdays for October that you display in the window there. I was born on National Coming Out Day. But you know, when you talk about, I did not know what it was. I didn't know. And these kids were very mean to me, you know, and I remember very clearly, I think I was 13 maybe, and some kids kept saying, "You're a homo, you're a homo." And I said, "Why are you calling me that? What does that mean? I don't understand." And he said, "You're a homosexual." And I went home in my father's library and looked it up, and then for the long, and I remember thinking, well, if they've got a word for it, then there must be other people, right? That was my first inkling that I was part of a community. And in those early days, so many of the zaps and the actions and the theatrics of it, it was really just about getting something in print that we existed. And when Harvey was elected, which was 77, you know, he talked about that a lot, that the Associated Press story went out, and these kids out in the hinterlands were going to read in the Associated Press story about a homosexual being elected to office. So I think I represent sort of the last generation that came of age during that period when it was so hidden. And it was through these performance art things and another thing that was when I learned about the pink triangle, that, and I can't remember, I think it was in the old Advocate, back when it was, before it became the Avocado, had somebody had found one of the charts with all of from the camps with all of the different symbols and what they meant. I remember just being astonished by that. And then when ACT UP took that symbol and turned it upside down, that was just, incredibly powerful for me, and I think many other people as well.
Which reminds me, go back to me when I look at what younger people are thinking about now. Younger than I was, I came out in college, seeing kids coming out in high school and before high school. They, just to some degree, see marriage as a symbol of equality. And I think when I first encountered the issue of family and such, it was largely, frankly, women who were dealing with children and family and custody cases in the 70s. That was the first March on Washington. That's the first time it was that I heard a discussion of the rights of families and parents and how that related to what we would begin to, I would begin to.
Jean Julian, is that her name?
I don't. A lot of people, and it sort of evolved, and then of course AIDS, and you have the image of, sick people needing to visit each other in a hospital and so on. But I think, at least I see younger people now as looking at, you watch some of the tapes on, It Gets Better and such, and you say, well, where do you want to be in 10 years? And they say, well, a number will say, I want to be married. I'm going to find somebody and I'm going to get married. And I realize this is a symbolism that marriage equals equality, which I think is what that means is, in part, this struggle is being done for equivalent folks. And I had a chilling experience, clearly. There was a story of a kid being killed in Buffalo, or killing himself in Buffalo as a result of bullying. And I'm from a suburb of Buffalo. And I went and looked up, and it turned out that the 14-year-old actually went to the high school that I graduated from, and he was being bullied there. And it made me realize, geez, here's a kid with so much more courage than I had in the same school, who basically could not take it. Now, there's been some change. Of course, the parents were supportive, and there was some of his friends demonstrated, but the situation was still bad enough that, at 14, he felt that he had no recourse. And as I look at these statements online, there are all these online statements, I again see them referring to, in fact, love, relationships, and to some degree, marriage itself. And I'm saying, do you see marriage as becoming now a symbol beyond the legal rights that we sort of first encountered it as?
Well, to some extent. I think one of the good things about the marriage struggle is that while many people approach it with from a sort of sentimental perspective, and a desire to express their love and to have that acknowledged in some way, there are the very important rights that accrue to heterosexuals through marriage that are still denied us, and people have become aware of that, and it's been useful. It's my own. I always have to say I'm old school, and if you told me in 1972, when I was joining the Gay Liberation Front, that in 2011 I'd be fighting for the right to join the army and get married, I probably would have tried dating women. I came from a very radical movement, and we were about smashing the patriarchy and ending war forever. I think that the impetus for this current drive for marriage equality, which sometimes, it's kind of interesting that the job discrimination seems to have fallen by the wayside. We fought in this state for years and years and years to get AB 1 passed, which offered some protection against job discrimination. I think that the focus on marriage really has its roots in the pandemic. And at least for my generation and for the one that came up immediately after us, that, it was like, after what we went through, how dare you? How dare you say this isn't a marriage? How dare you say this is not a family? What we lived through, every single person was engaged. You had no choice. I do know a couple of people that really literally ran away and hid, but most people stayed and fought, and it didn't mean necessarily being out in the street. It might have meant, never leaving your house for months and months while you cared for your partner or your roommate. So I think that for those of us who went through that, and then to have people say, no, that's not a marriage, that's not good enough, it was sort of, forgive me, but it was like, fuck you, how dare you say that's not a marriage? So I am concerned, though, that I'll be very curious. I hope I live really, really long, because I'm very curious to see what happens to us after we're legal. And I'm a little worried about it. Sometimes I feel that the community is very self-absorbed, and I wonder where this energy will go after we win these legal battles. I remember when it was called gay liberation, and I'm dismayed by some of the politics, but the parts that I find most exciting are the strategies and campaigns that are emerging out of the culture. In my view, very little that is exciting has come out of the big organizations recently, but there's a lot that's incredibly exciting that's come from the grassroots, and most of it is using art and in new and exciting ways that might well keep us together as a community and a movement after the immediate political objectives are achieved.
Yeah, I agree, and it's one of the things so exciting about this whole set of days is it focuses on the cultural aspects, and I agree. I'm firmly of the opinion as well, Cleve, that even if equality was achieved, the culture remains. That the culture is not a result of just being an oppressed people with that which is in common, our oppression, that there's more, and that therefore culture continues afterwards, and art in various different sets of forms. But it's an interesting discussion. Frankly, Cleve and I are the same age. I'm a little older than Cleve, roughly. There was no, I had no hope of equality. When I was young, I didn't think, well, gee, someday maybe we'll actually be able to get married. I'll get Social Security from her. That was, and there was a certain freeing to that. But so this was a very theoretical question. Should we ever achieve actual equality within America? And it's interesting because, one of the things about the poem that, equality is in the air we breathe. In Langston Hughes' poem, it's such a hopeful poem about America, where he basically says, let America be, it never was to me, and I swear America, this America will be again. He's saying he believes in 1937 Jim Crow America, that there will be an America that will have, equality will be in the air we breathe. And it's just, I guess I've become more optimistic as time goes on. If you asked me in 75, I would not have thought we'd ever get.
No, and I never thought I'd live long enough to see the Marines recruiting at gay pride celebrations, and I'm not really sure how I feel about that. I'm seriously ambivalent on this one. So, I think it's, I think the epidemic proved the community. I think the idea of a gay community was almost theoretical until AIDS. And I think that, definitively proved that we were, in fact, a community. And it's going to be very interesting to see what happens next. I think we should open this up, though, so people please feel free to add to this. And I'd be curious to know how many of you have been down to the Occupy San Francisco camp. If you haven't, go check it out. I mean, you might not like it, but I'm fascinated by what's going on down there and the rituals and cultural stuff that's going on there. It's very new, and it's only 2 months old, and they have a whole new vocabulary to go with their movement, but it's pretty fascinating.
And there's also an Occupy San Francisco Arts and Performance series. They have their own Facebook page. I would recommend that you check it out to see who's performing down at the site. So we are going to open it for questions, and my job is just to kind of repeat so that we can hear it. But I guess I have the opportunity that I can kind of throw out the first question. And for both of you, I'm wondering, as you are working with younger people, what kind of new forms of community do you see kind of coalescing? I mean, I agree with you. I'm old enough, too, that I couldn't imagine being out in high school. And even in the Simon Fujiwara piece, we're working with young actors who play a young version of Simon Fujiwara. And there's some explicit sexual content in the script, and so we have to vet it through their parents and make sure they're all comfortable with it. And every parent has been like, well, we're all part of the straight gay alliance at the high school, and you just sit there like, what? How amazing! And when you're having people come to to the museum, or Cleve, when you're speaking around the country, do you see a kind of new, how could you describe new queer communities?
Just last week here in San Francisco, I visited 2 schools, very different schools. One is John O'Connell High School on Folsom between 19th and 20th, which is the poorest performing high school in the city. It's the most segregated. It has the lowest test scores, the lowest graduation rate, the highest gang membership among the students. And then I also spoke to the 6th graders. At John O'Connell, I spoke to the seniors there. And then the same week I spoke at a very privileged private school called Live Oak, base of Potrero Hill on Mariposa, to the 6th grade class. And in both of the conversations, there was discussion of sexuality, of safer sex practices to avoid HIV transmission, conversations about Harvey Milk, nothing negative. It was astonishing to me. And afterwards, both groups wrote me letters. That was part of what they, had to do. And the letters from the kids were just so this was a non-issue for them. In a 6th grade class, to be able to be talking about homosexuality and homosexual behavior, and there were no sidelong glances, there were no snickers. It was just open faces, open hearts, completely loving, accepting. I said, is there any bullying at this school? And they said, no, we would never allow that. We would never allow it. And they have a gay-straight alliance in this, which is a middle school. And the same thing at O'Connell. And here I am, this old white gay guy coming into this school where these kids are facing just extraordinary challenges on so many fronts every day. And there are openly gay teachers. They had an openly gay principal until last year. And the kids were just wonderful, wonderful. So it is changing, but I don't think it's really addressed. Obviously, we wouldn't have so many kids offing themselves we mustn't be complacent. And as heartwarming as it is for our generation to see this kind of progress, it is still horrendous. And it's also, we live in such a special city. I was really struck by that after visiting these 2 schools, what a unique city this is and how far we've come.
Can I take some questions from the audience? Go ahead.
It's more of a comment. Do you say Cleve?
Cleve.
Yes. When you spoke about your experience as a child of being ironically mirrored by your classmates, and it reminded me of the performance. In the first scene, or is it the second scene where he's sitting with the young man? Is that the first scene or the second?
So the comment is about the Fujiwara performance, which has a section called the mirror stage, about the way that we only recognize who we are and who we love and desire in others that mirror us. Go ahead, Jenny.
Well, I'm just struck by some of the themes that are continuous over the generations, and in particular, the role of conservative religious morality to shut down discussion about sexuality and to try to negate opportunities for queer people, and how much that was dominant in the Reagan years, and that it's still a huge problem. So I guess I'd put it as a question, that because it seems to me the desire to have this movement be about both liberation and equality, that's been the work of the movement from earliest days, and it's still the work of the movement to achieve liberation. But I guess I'm interested in thoughts from both of you about what we've learned about ways to address conservative religious groups in this America, where that's been part of our struggle from the beginning of not just this movement, but many movements.
So just to repeat the question for the videos, the stream, is a question about how do we address, particularly conservative religious movements that are actively working to block progress with the community.
Yes, my take is don't address the movement's leaders of the movement per se, but address the people who see themselves sort of influenced by the movement or part of whatever group that they're in. Go to the individuals, and I think the culture, or approaching them culturally through, say, a TV show, a movie, art, demonstrations that have, like the quilt, for example, it reaches people in ways that surprises them. They didn't expect to be reached, and suddenly they're reached. And then I think the second thing is the old message of, from Harvey and before, which is come out. People like us if they know us. And I think insofar as one-on-one contact occurs, that's how you defeat those movements. And I approaching them one-on-one face. One of the positive developments around marriage, for example, is the fact that so many more the queer couples are raising children, which means they're now interfacing in the schools and other places
PTA.
with non-gay couples and their children. And so, the same struggles, same babysitters, same issues. To me, that's one-on-one. Now, whatever church the other people belong to, they have to, the person in my PTA who has their daughter, how would this influence them? To me, I don't think I guess I don't want to give power to the leaders of that institution. And I take umbrage with the fact that the Catholic Church has a better moral attitude towards youth than the queer community. For example, I just don't buy it. I don't want to give them any of that. I just want to step away from that whole leadership, kind of what I see as bizarre, crazy debate, and talk to the individuals on an individual basis.
I agree with those points, and I would just add that we have to watch our attitude too. Most of us on the left, most of us in the queer community are not affiliated with a church. And if we are, it's a church that's been really stripped down from all of this other stuff. And I was raised Quaker, so I don't carry around with me all of the anger of being rejected by my church. I am not a believer, however, and I think that I myself, for many, many years, was guilty of great arrogance in my thoughts about believers. So I'm not a believer, I'm not a Christian, but I have come to believe that all people of faith are potential allies in the struggle for peace and social justice. And I see evidence of this every day in my union. I don't work much in the gay movement anymore. I work primarily in the labor movement. And my union is made up almost entirely of immigrants. And almost all of them are devout believers in whatever their faith is. We've got a large number of Muslims, Catholics, Baptists, Mormons. And it's really interesting to see how you can break through and how open they are. But it doesn't work if you go into it with some of this arrogance that, a lot of people in our community are openly and constantly, overtly contemptuous of people of any kind of faith at all. And I don't think that that is useful.
Can you talk a little bit about the importance of the film Milk for you, and whether you having known Harvey, what your impressions were of it, and then also what the cultural importance of that film was for you?
So the question is about Cleve's involvement in the film Milk by Gus Van Sant.
Well, I think it had that month, November of 2008, in my view, was the month that changed everything. And I think that the film was part of it. I think the biggest thing that happened was that we elected a man named Barack Obama to the White House, and I'm somewhat disappointed with him on a number of issues, but we can be as cynical as we want. Electing him was an extraordinary milestone in the history of this country, and it gave people the idea that change is possible. Then in California on the same night we had Prop 8, which kind of bitch-slapped the young people who thought they were free, and suddenly they were put back in touch with the reality of our second-class citizenship. And then the film came out and informed this new generation of a history that they had not been taught in school, and also showed them a political strategy that worked when we won a statewide election 33 years ago with none of the kind of resources that we have today. As I recall, Harvey's last campaign budget, the final campaign where he won, I think was a total of $30,000. And we in San Francisco were like, oh my God, how could we raise $30,000? So it showed the power of grassroots organizing, it informed people, and I think that month ignited this modern resurgence. I've never, in my time, I have not seen anything like it. And it's not, I don't think it's just my own perspective, because somebody did a mashup of all the polls that have been done over the last 40 years. And what you see is a very steady, slow increase. And though we in the community often have, how many times have you heard people say, oh, there's a backlash coming, or, despite our perceptions of peaks and valleys, the polls don't reflect that at all. If you look at 40 years of polling, you see very, very, very slow, steady increase towards acceptance and the belief in equality. And then in 2008 and 2009, that line went straight up. So I think that the film did contribute, but I wouldn't, it's not just that one film, it's just the amazing developments in popular culture that have made us, who've taken us from invisible to ubiquitous. Glee, for example, is incredibly important. I can't stand the show, but it's incredibly important. All of the young people that watch this program, it's so popular, and every single episode there are positive gay images, and so it's extraordinary what's happened, and I'm proud to have been part of making Milk happen. I think we did a good job. There are parts of it that I cringe at, but I think, honestly, the part I like the most about it is that Sean did such a good job that people who never met Harvey actually, I do think, have some idea of what he really was like, because it was an extraordinary performance.
Can I just comment, Cleve? I think you're being modest. I think the film happened because you played an absolutely critical role in the film coming into existence. We opened the museum that same weekend. We were trying to get open for the film, and the number one question we got at the museum, the temporary exhibit, and then the permanent exhibit is, can you tell us where Harvey Milk's camera store is? So that gives you an idea of the importance of Milk. Many of the people who come to the temporary exhibit and the museum are not gay people. They're coming looking for culture. And often if you ask them, we don't even ask them, do you know anything about GLBT history anymore? We ask them, have you seen the film Milk? And most have seen the film Milk, and that means they have some grounding of where things, of sort of a beginning point to begin the discussion of GLBT history. So, there's some gauge of the importance of that film to people's understanding of the community.
So, go ahead.
One of the things that seems to me common between the Quilt and the film Milk is the way both were so successful in humanizing gay people to people who might have thought that they didn't know anybody gay, or who might otherwise have had a very sort of hostile opinion with respect to those who were suffering during the pandemic. And I'm wondering what you think might be some sort of similar type of visual message or way of communicating with these people that could work for the movement in the future, and where should we be trying to go in doing that kind of thing?
So the question is about like the Names Project and like Milk. What are future strategies for kind of either humanizing or ripping away the demonization of queer people?
These kinds of ideas are emerging all the time. I think what Dan Savage has done, is pretty remarkable, and I think that's really a continuation of exactly the same strategy. People telling their stories. This. When AIDS was beginning, because people were so squeamish and the stigma was so great, during that first decade, what is the quote where If it happens to you, it's a tragedy. If it happens to 1,000 people, it's a statistic. I've mangled that. I apologize to the source. But it was being talked about just in statistics, percentages of hemophiliacs, percentages of Haitian immigrants, percentages of homosexuals. And when I first had the idea that night at the Candlelight March, when we carried the names of people, and when I asked people to do that, I was just trying to break through the reality that parents were ashamed to list the cause of death, and people were actually vanishing. The stigma associated with it was so horrendous that you couldn't even name the people. You know, it was just these statistics. And so the quilt began at the Candlelight March, where we asked people to write on a piece of paper the name of their neighbor or friend or loved one who had passed away, and people were reluctant to do so because of the stigma. And then when people began to write the first and last names, that alone was sort of, hair-raising. And we marched down to the Federal Building, and I'd hidden extension ladders in the shrubbery, and we climbed up and covered the wall. And that was when I looked at that patchwork and thought of Grandma. But it was from the very beginning, it was, I think one of the first sentences that I came up with was to reveal the humanity behind the statistics. And this is actually an organizing tool in my union. If we're building an underground committee at some Hyatt hotel and trying to organize the housekeepers who speak many different languages and come from many different faith backgrounds and circumstances, one of the first things that we do to build solidarity within this group that's going to have to work together and take risks is this personal storytelling. Where do you come from? How did you get here? What are the issues you're facing? Are you a single mom from Guatemala who lost your family in a war, and you've got a kid with special needs, and and then we use that as a tool. So it's very effective, and I think the most recent example is Dan Savage, and I think that it works very well in political organizing. We did, when I went to New Mexico for Courage campaign, we were trying to get their senators to sign on to the Feinstein bill. And instead of just doing a petition, we did it online, we created a petition, but we had people tell their story of how they knew their senator. So then we printed them, and we contacted these people and had them physically go to the office and present these, one-page stories. I'm having a Rick Perry moment. What's the name of the senator?
Our senator?
Of New Mexico. Does anybody know the senators from New Mexico? Okay, Rick Perry. Oops. But it was effective. The staffers, when they got there, they looked at it and they saw these names and the street address. They knew it was in the district, and there were these personal stories of their constituents talking about their gay kids or their gay neighbors or whatever. It remains, I think, the single most important strategy in the movement is coming out, telling the story, revealing who we are and the circumstances of our lives.
I agree entirely, and I would add just adding it, personally saying why it's important. In other words, I have kids, I need this legislation for this. I've been with my partner, they might get sick, I need this. Mm-hmm. And actually asking, saying, this is why we need this. To me, that's compelling, because then you have to look at people they know and say, despite what my preacher says, I hear you. You really do need this. This will really hurt you. I think they need to know. I think people who don't support gay marriage need to know that it actually really hurts people. Mm-hmm. That they know that there's a real loss. There is symbolic for it, and there's also other things, but there's a real loss. Artistically, I'm not quite sure the best mechanism to go with that. I suspect, as Cleve says, it's probably online, it's probably viral. I think Modern Family, in addition to Glee, was showing gay couples with gay children is, what is that, the number of a major hit show. I do think it'll be online, and there's where I sort of look for the great, the Silence Equals Death. I think the equivalent of Silence Equals Death is going to appear on virally. And I'm sort of watching for it because I think that's probably where it'll occur.
It was Senator Udall. when in talking with the members of my union, who are overwhelmingly people of faith, and it's through that kind of storytelling that I'm able to get them to look at the marriage issue not as a religious issue and not as a sexual issue. And I often do it by talking about Del and Phyllis, and I just say, look, I knew these two women. They were my mom and dad have been together 58 years now. Del and Phyllis were together longer. And I talk about Social Security benefits. I had a fascinating conversation with a bunch of our members in Honolulu who were mostly Mormon and Catholic. And there's a lot of military bases there, and almost all of our members have family members who are serving in one of the other branches. And when you talk to them about, just the reality, you just tell these stories about, here are these two women, they've been together, one of them serving in Iraq. If she dies, the partner's not going to get death benefits. They've got two kids, and I think it breaks through a lot of that. But I'll be very curious to see what happens next. But Dan Savage, one of the things that came out of the National Equality March, we made a commitment at the National Equality March to try to organize district by district, have a presence in each district. And of course that didn't happen immediately, but or through that network, that particular network. But it has happened through Courage Campaign and through Dan Savage. We now have these stories from all of these different places that show that we exist everywhere, and gets people to it's amazing. I think we often forget how focused people remain on the sexual part of us. And as I get older, the sexual part of my life diminishes weekly. But I think that's just a really big problem. We have to get people to sort of look above the crotch and see us entirely.
And so I think we'll take one more, and then we'll take a break and move to our third movement.
So my name is Tetsuya. I moved from Japan 3 years ago to here, and now I'm in a undergraduate program. And when I first moved here, I just thought all the Americans are open like this, like open-minded. But actually, I was really happy to hear about what people have done in the past, and that's why it's so open in San Francisco. And I was wondering if I go back to Japan and try to do some movement, how do you think I should gather people together what's the first step to
So the question is about what's the first step of taking our American gay organizing history and exporting it?
Well, take it away, Paul.
Listen, I would say listen to what the community, where they're at, and where the larger society is and the larger culture is. I think the first step would be to listen clearly to what the queer community itself, what their problems are, what they're willing to do, and also what the community, where the community is, and then then from that emerges where you can move forward. I don't think that the American experience on gay activism, queer activism, is readily exportable, and actually, to some degree, has been counterproductive in some different places and countries and cultures. So I guess I would say if I was going anywhere and beginning activism, first thing, listen to what the community itself is saying they want, and what the culture and the society there, what opportunities they do. And if you can connect it to history, the GLBT Historical Society, I would do so. I think if you can ground it in the tradition that people already will recognize and accept, that's always helpful to organizing. You're not trying to change things, except insofar as is already, intrinsic within the culture, such as equality is intrinsic, and Americans would acknowledge.
Yeah. I think it's funny because sometimes activism is about confronting and shocking. And, I've been on every side you could think of these strategies. I've been in my youth, outlandish hairdos and garb and very confrontational, in-your-face, shocking actions that were not really intended to persuade people, but to break down the door and let people know, and be angry and be shocking. Often there is something to be gained by being shocking. And then there's been times when I've very deliberately, as with the quilt, sort of appropriated. I kept thinking this. I said we need middle class, middle American, traditional family value symbols. It was a very deliberate attempt to, appropriate those kinds of symbols and imagery to be the opposite of shocking, to be warm and gentle and American. And so I would imagine, though I know nothing about Japan, I would imagine that you're going to would have to walk a balance with that and know that sometimes there is value in shocking and confronting, and sometimes there is value in stepping back and lowering your voice and using vocabulary and imagery that are not shocking and allow people to look at you with ease.
Paul, Cleve, thank you.
Thank you.